me start off with something every musician and every economic developer needs to hear. The music industry, the startup world, you know what? They're the same business model. They're both built around hunting unicorns. The record labels, they're just venture capitalists. They just have guitars and keyboards and auto-tune. They sign 100 acts and they're hoping that one explodes, and that one hit's got to pay for the other 99. Venture capitalists, the VCs, they're doing the same thing. They're going to fund 100 startups, and they're hoping for that billion-dollar unicorn exit. I think the difference is kind of what came next. The startup world, it evolved. The founders, they figured out how to win, and they didn't need a gatekeeper. They learned to bootstrap, crowdfunding, launching from their garages, our garages, building real businesses and real ventures without venture capital. They turned innovation into infrastructure. It's the approach we took at BusinessFlare. It's the approach we're taking now with Street Economics, our economic development AI. But the music world, they didn't do that. They didn't turn innovation to infrastructure. They're still operating under that 1950s venture capital model of record labels. And if you're not a unicorn in music, the system, it's just really doesn't have a path for you. You're going to gig bars. You're going to sell T-shirts from your trunk. Stream on platforms for fractions and fractions of pennies and wait for something or something to break you out, make you an overnight success after 20 years. And then when that doesn't happen, it can get real easy to slide into victimhood. Start believing the other things you hear in other artists say and other even fans say, that the system's rigged, that, you only get real success if you get a record deal. It's impossible to build something that can be sustained on its own. That, our venues keep closing. Our venues don't care. Our venues rip us off. The record labels screw us over. The fans don't show up. The media doesn't cover the local scene. On and on and on. Excuses and victimization. I get it. I've lived it. I've heard it. I've been one of those guys loading amps through a back alley, and the bar made $10,000 and the band went home with maybe gas money. I played shows to 3 people and shows to packed houses, and the band still, doesn't make anything. And so I understand that side of the business, and I understand the other side. The cities that are trying to, quote, support the arts, but they don't understand the economics of it. The developers chase creative placemaking, but they don't have a clue how to fix the actual systems that make it impossible for musicians and other types of creators to actually make money and actually contribute to the place. That's why the artists always move on. There's too much friction. There's too many assumptions and lack of understanding, so the artists go to the next place. They don't stick around. And so I realized something kind of sitting between both of these worlds. And I don't know, the other day I thought about this and thought about the idea for this episode and for digging in deeper even with some of the other content that you'll find on our Patreon that really gets in depth in here. And I think it kind of started in thinking about just the entrepreneurial and innovation framework in episode 4. And it just kind of hit me the other day that, the record companies, they are just VCs. Just industry specific. And, the startup, and so I thought the startup world, they solved this problem already. They stopped chasing unicorns and started building the systems that made success scalable for all kinds of entrepreneurs. They build ecosystems and they remove the friction. They have tools that people can create wealth from their own ideas. Entrepreneurs are creators just like musicians and other types of artists are. We, on our own team, we see ourselves as collaborative enterprise and as creators and as artists, not as economists and not as planners. We don't think of ourselves that way. And so the musicians and the cities, hey, this is Music Cities podcast, and the cities that depend on musicians and other artists can take the same path. So that's what we're here today for. How do you apply the founder mentality to the creative economy? How to stop waiting for a savior, start building systems that actually work? So, the broken venture model, the music industry loves to talk about art, but it's built on math, and it's bad math. It's a venture model that just never evolved. The labels spread their bets across hundreds of artists. They know that the majority of them are going to fail. Those are the ones that are filling the clubs, trying to push merch, scraping up coins for studio time, and they're all subsidizing the one breakout success that makes the label look like they were smart and discovered something. It's the same math that venture capital started off with. Invest in 100 startups and pray that one becomes a unicorn. Then you just write off the rest of them. But where the startup world changed is they created new paths. The other 99, they found their own way. They weren't going to give up. They weren't going to play victim. They created something, damn it, and they're pushing it forward, just like we are. The founders figured out that they can build real companies, and they didn't need the 1 in 100 investor check. Bootstrap businesses and indie game studios, small companies, local e-commerce companies and brands, they build their own stacks and create their own markets. And that's how they make real money. Some of these entrepreneurs do really well without, quote, selling out. But the music side never built that infrastructure. It's always been locked in that dependency, waiting for discovery, being under someone's thumb, whether it's a record company or the venue, management. So they're just waiting for discovery instead of designing their own success. And so the result is just this culture of frustration, nostalgia. Musicians, they complain that labels steal their equity, venues underpay, fans don't buy music anymore, it's all streaming and downloads. It's all true, but it doesn't change. None of that's going to change until you change how the system works. Just change your little part of the system. Because complaining is not a business model. Design is, and that's what the startup world learned years ago, and it's past due time that music caught up. So how'd the founders fix the unicorn trap? They built the systems that do 3 things. They reduce friction, it spreads the risk, and it creates flow. Friction is just going to kill creativity, whether it's in music or other entrepreneurial innovation. This is where rubber meets the road with cities. Cities can talk all they want, but if they're not removing the friction that matters, they can talk all they want about economic development. Because that friction, it kills the creativity, it kills the innovation. Risk without reward kills motivation. And flow, the flow, that's going to build the confidence, and that's going to bring the capital. And so the startups, they reduced the friction by building platforms. They created the distribution tools like Shopify. They created capital tools like Kickstarter. All these tools were created by innovators, entrepreneurs, startups. Patreon, community tool. And they made it easier for people to take an idea and turn it into income without asking for anybody's permission, especially the VCs. It's what the musicians need. It's what they already have. It's where entrepreneurs have created these things, and a lot of musicians use these. I think there's a mindset shift, though, that's needed as part of this. You can release globally with DistroKid or TuneCore. Bandcamp or Shopify, you're selling straight to your fans. You can create recurring revenue and create a real community or tribe on Patreon. You can use crowdfunding to raise capital for a record or tour. Those tools exist. And thousands and tens of thousands of musicians and bands are using those tools. But what doesn't exist in at least a broad sense, like the startup community, is the mindset doesn't exist. Not in a contagious way. A founder sees an obstacle and he builds around it and builds a solution to it. A musician sees the same obstacle and just as often might write a Facebook post about how unfair the industry is. Victimhood, it feels righteous. It feels true. But it doesn't change anything. The only way to win is to stop playing their game and build your own. And you've heard stories about that already on this podcast by musicians and artists who have done that. But there's so many more examples outside of the music industry of innovators and creators and founders that have done this. Also, if you're a city, economic developer, city manager, do the same thing. You don't have to chase your unicorn companies. You don't have to land Amazon HQ2. You got to build the ecosystems that make it easy for your hundreds of small founders or musicians to succeed. Your musicians are entrepreneurs. In cities, you don't understand that. Realize your creators, your artists, they're entrepreneurs and they're businesses that need to be retained in your community just like any other business you think of. That's how you're going to create your economic resilience. And so the startup playbook, it works for local economies. It works for created industries the same way. You can empower, remove friction. Don't subsidize, don't overregulate. Bet on the builders, not the bureaucrats. And so the playbook, what does this really look like? So step one, you got to own your stack. In the startup world, founders own their technology. In music, you got to own your masters. You got to own your channels, own your audience. If you don't, you're not independent. You're an employee. You're an employee of the streaming companies. Then you got to build your tribe. A startup, it's the user base. For you, it's fans. But it's the same thing. It's people who believe in what you're building. It's people who are connected to each other and you through the concept that you bring. And you don't need millions of them. Be realistic. What could 1,000 true believers who buy, share, and invest in you mean for your artistic music endeavor? Or even just 100 to start. That's where the recurrence comes from. And then step 3, align incentives. Startups, they're using equity and options. And that gives everyone skin in the game. And that gives the ability to grow and to scale and again, enhance that resilience. Musicians can do the same thing. Use platforms, use, Royal, and there's some others that, sell fractional ownership in songs. I know this sounds hard, but you got to work. Just like startups, just like founders. Founders are working their asses off, trying to bring their ventures to market, and you got to do the same thing. Let your fans become investors. When they profit, they promote. Same way that happens with things like Kickstarter and crowdfunding. Then step 4, create your moat. In tech, a moat is your edge. In music, it's your authenticity. It's the thing about you that nobody can copy. Instead of chasing mainstream, dominate your niche, your sub-niche, your subgenre, and do it so deeply that imitation is irrelevant. And we've talked about that before in this podcast, on some of our episodes. And then step 5, take that flow and scale it. Scale the shit out of it. Once you remove that friction, then the flow becomes the growth engine. You can diversify your income and your merch. Maybe there's licensing opportunities. Create workshops, experiences, and community memberships. In the startup world, it's a revenue stack. Build one. Build one in music. And so it's the founder's playbook, and it's not glamorous, but it's sustainable. But it takes work, and it takes a lot of work. And it takes, more importantly, a shift in mindset. But this playbook, it does work. It's been proven by the startup world. So learn from that. Use it. And in cities, you can do the same thing. And build your infrastructure. That helps create your flow. You need green lights and not red tape. Don't be a red tape empire. Don't think of creative industries as cute side projects. Start treating them like the growth sector that they are and that they can be. They set your brand and then they abandon you because the friction just becomes too much to bear. So the same way the founders built their ecosystems for entrepreneurs, cities, you can help build the ecosystems for the creators, but in a way that changes your mindset and how you approach creators and artists as well. You got to remove that friction. Friction is a hidden tax on creativity. It's the only way that I can think to describe it. And there's a lot of different frictions, and every place is going to have unique situations. But in music, friction, it's a permit process that makes it harder to play a show than open a bar. It's a zoning code that treats rehearsal rooms like industrial hazards, or the streaming model that pays fractions of pennies for work that can change the culture. Essentially, friction is bureaucracy. Whether we're talking about musicians or startups or innovators or anything entrepreneurial or business related, the friction is the bureaucracy. It's the red tape. It's indecision. It's the fear of risk that is contagious and addictive inside city halls. It's committees that study what the founders already know. And by the time the committee finishes, the moment's gone. It's regulations that protect mediocrity and stifle innovation. But every time you remove the friction, you're going to increase people being in the zone and their ability to create and innovate and see things that no one else sees. And the best music cities, when you think about the music cities in the world, they're not the ones with the biggest events. They may have some events, but big events doesn't make a music city. They're the ones that make it easy to create. They all learn that, simplicity beats subsidy. You fix the systems and the art, just like the economy, will take care of itself. Set the table. But everything we've talked about comes down to mindset. Startups, musicians start from the same place. I got a crazy idea and it's probably going to fail. We're not going to make it, but we're going to try. But one created the systems and mentorship and started generating money, and the other one got gatekeepers and they get rejection letters. But it's the same DNA. It's exactly the same. And so the thing about innovation, it never looks serious at first. Baby metal was called a gimmick 15 years ago. 15 headlining years later. Steve Jobs was called delusional. The Wright brothers were insane. But every big breakthrough, every big innovation starts off as a punchline and a target. Thing about victimhood is you're just going to remain a punchline. Founders are going to push through it. Founders are going to punch back. Founders don't care. So if you're a musician, don't wait for someone to discover you. If you're a city, stop waiting for the next corporate headquarters to save you. Discovery, you're just hoping on luck in that case. Design is strategy and the tactics that go along with it. The future is always design. The future has always belonged to the people who design the systems that pay for value, not exposure. And so that's another place that, especially musicians, you got to think about. Stop giving your art away for, quote, exposure. And I know all the arguments about that. And I know all of the arguments about the next band is just going to do it for free because they want exposure. But, it doesn't hold water. It's just another excuse. So the question is, are you chasing a unicorn or are you building a system? Because when you own your own stack and your tribe, your niche, you're not waiting anymore. You're scaling. But you got to have that mindset shift. And you got to have the will to do whatever it takes and act like a startup founder. But you also got to remember that just because you create something doesn't mean that anybody wants to buy it. And so that's the danger. And that's where the danger again comes of falling back into that victim mentality. But that's not what happens with founders. You'll see founders and they'll go bankrupt. The venture doesn't work. They step right back up and they try another one. They have another idea. They become serial entrepreneurs. And not every idea is going to work, because not every idea is going to resonate with the market. And it's the same thing with musicians. Just because you take on a startup founder mindset still doesn't mean anybody's going to want to buy your music or pay to get into a place to listen to it. So it's where you got to start kind of balancing what you're creating and what you want to do with it. You know, if you want to create art for art's sake, that's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate. But is it realistic from a career or income perspective? It's a decision that you have to make. There's plenty of examples of artists who have created for themselves and it resonated with the market and they became very successful. And we want more of that. What we don't want more of is the other end of the spectrum, which is creating just for the market. There's nothing authentic in there, and it's not even art. It's music without a soul when it's just being created for the market. That's why auto-tune was invented. But there's a place there in the middle where you're creating something real and you're creating something authentic, but you are watching and paying attention to what's out there and what might resonate and learning from that. That's the startup space. So if you really want to do this, you have to change your mindset and you have to push through. So you've been listening to the Music Cities podcast powered by Street Economics. You know, we've got full companion reports on both Patreons, Street Economics and Music Cities. We've got additional insights in there for our subscribers. And so, because the future of the music economy is not about unicorns, it's about the founders who stopped waiting to be discovered and started building. So get to work. Start building yours. Until next time, let's do it. See ya.